So again, in this session this afternoon, like yesterday afternoon, we're going to move into the compassion wing of practice. As I think I already mentioned yesterday, if we really get into the Shamatha practice, or even for that fact, the Vipassana practice, if we really go into those practices in depth, and not balance our practice with the compassion wing of the practice, then we can end up in not a very healthy state. Because both the Shamatha practice and the Vipassana practice can tend to get us a little bit self-absorbed and a bit disconnected from the world. In fact, the Shamatha practice on its own could be used as a way of withdrawing from all that mess out there into this nice little bubble of peace here. And then, of course, if anyone interferes with my little world of peace, watch out. So the Shamatha practice can end up being a little bit of a withdrawal mechanism, and that's not very healthy. So we need to stay connected in the world, and we need to have a good focus, a good perspective of our Shamatha practice, and for that reason it's very important to also focus on the compassion wing of practice. And yesterday we looked at the practice of loving kindness as part of that, and today we're going to be looking at the actual practice of compassion. Compassion in Sanskrit is karuna, and compassion is defined simply as the wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. And again, as with the loving kindness practice, it's very much recommended that we cultivate this in stages. That first we cultivate compassion to our friends, people close to us, most easy, then slowly expand that aspiration out to people we don't know very well, and then a little bit further out to people who we find a little bit difficult, and then eventually towards all living beings. So these are usually the stages mentioned, but as we mentioned yesterday, as with the loving kindness practice, I think in our modern society we need to add one more stage in that cultivation, and that is at the very beginning to cultivate compassion for ourselves. Because again, we often don't, or we're not very kind and compassionate to ourselves. And so often in this compassion practice, people find it quite difficult sometimes to develop compassion for themselves. And also people find it quite difficult to develop compassion for people who behave badly, particularly people who try to harm them or harm their friends. And what we're going to do after this meditation is have a look at one of the main reasons why we often find it difficult to have compassion for ourselves and to have compassion for people who behave badly. So that's one of the things I'd like to talk about a little bit after the meditation. Now, as with the loving kindness, if we really want to develop compassion for ourselves and others, the wish for ourselves to be free of suffering and its causes, then of course we need to appreciate what do we mean by suffering and what are the actual causes of suffering. Because of course we all want to be free of suffering, but often we're not really clearly aware of what is suffering and what is the underlying cause. And often we tend to blame people and things out there as the cause for our suffering. And so then to try to overcome suffering, what we do is of course develop a lot of aversion to those unpleasant people and things out there that seems to be causing me suffering, and we try and push away them, avoid them, and that doesn't really help us to overcome suffering. So here we need to appreciate what we mean by suffering and what are the causes. Now, from a Buddhist perspective, this word suffering takes on a very broad meaning. in our normal daily life, of course, the word suffering, usually we identify that with some sort of unpleasant, painful physical or mental experience. And of course, that's something we don't want. So this is fairly obvious. This is something we're trying to overcome. But from a Buddhist perspective, we can talk about more subtle levels of suffering. And the word that we use is used in Buddhism to describe this sort of unsatisfactoriness is the word dukkha, which actually is the first of the Four Noble Truths, which most commonly is translated as suffering. And so then often this first noble truth is presented in a way of saying, you know, according to Buddhism, all life is suffering. And then often when we hear that, we think, oh, that doesn't sound right, you know, because sometimes I have nice things happen in my life, pleasant experiences, so that doesn't sound right. But again, that word suffering there is a translation of the word dukkha. And this word dukkha is very difficult to translate and has a much broader meaning than what we understand normally with the word suffering. So therefore, when we see this presentation of the Four Noble Truths, the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, we need to understand that word suffering has a much broader meaning. Of course, it encompasses our unpleasant, painful experiences. But also part of the human condition is we have pleasant experiences. This also comes under the umbrella of dukkha. And even our pleasant experiences are not completely satisfactory. Because why? Because they simply don't last. And they require some sort of stimulus for them to be present. So, and they're actually not even in the nature of happiness, because if those pleasant experiences were in the nature of happiness, it would mean the more we engaged in those pleasant experiences, the more happy we should become. But we often understand that if we overindulge in pleasant experiences, they actually often turn into suffering. So if we can understand that our pleasant experiences are unsatisfactory in that sense, then that's also part of the understanding of the word dukkha. But at the deepest level, this word dukkha also encompasses the idea that we're stuck in this sort of state whereby there's always a potential for suffering to arise. And why is that the case? It's because our mind is contaminated. Our mind is contaminated by the mental afflictions such as anger, jealousy, craving, fear, anxiety, and depression, and so forth. As long as these mental afflictions are in our mind, we're stuck, and there's always the potential for suffering to arise. So that also is part of this meaning of the word dukkha. So here when we talk about compassion, the wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes, we're not just wishing ourselves and others to be free of unpleasant, painful experiences. We're also wishing ourselves and others at the deepest level to be free of the potential of any of unpleasant experiences coming up. And so therefore we're also wishing to be free of the causes of this. And the causes are the mental afflictions, and particularly this fundamental ignorance that is the root of all of our mental afflictions and suffering. So this is sort of compassion at the deepest level. That also is part of compassion. And if we can really develop this aspiration of compassion, and remember, just like loving kindness, compassion in Buddhism is not an emotion. Compassion is an aspiration, a wish. It's a wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. And if we can really develop that wish for ourselves to be free of suffering and its causes, understanding what this word suffering is and the real causes, we can then develop in Buddhism what is called this mind of renunciation. This mind, and again, renunciation is not a very good translation of what the original Sanskrit term here means. The original Sanskrit term here is this wish for liberation from suffering, this aspiration for liberation. So by understanding, by developing this sincere compassion for ourselves, that translates into then having a wish for being liberated from suffering through eliminating the causes of suffering. So again, what we're going to do in this meditation is we're going to begin by cultivating this aspiration of compassion for ourselves and then slowly expand it out to others in this meditation. So let's do a 20-minute meditation on cultivating compassion for ourselves and others. And then I'd like to have a look at, again, particularly these 2 points. Why do we often find it difficult to have compassion for ourselves? And why do we often find it difficult to have compassion for people who behave badly? So let's do the meditation first, though. So again, finding a nice, comfortable posture. So allowing your awareness to descend into the body, becoming aware of sensations throughout the body. And using the out-breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. Allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. And with each out-breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen. And simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. focusing on the sensations of the breath throughout the body. Compassion is the wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. And we can begin our cultivation of compassion by focusing on ourselves, cultivating compassion for ourselves, and then expanding that out to others. No matter how much mental afflictions we have in our mind, no matter how much anger and jealousy and craving and fear, anxiety are in our mind, these mental afflictions are simply like dirt covering the surface of our mind. And underneath these mental afflictions is the natural purity of our mind. This natural purity of mind is often called our Buddha nature. So imagine this deepest dimension of your mind in the form of a small white radiant sphere of light in the center of your chest at the level of your heart. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if I were free of suffering and its causes. May I be free of all mental afflictions and suffering. And then imagine your mental afflictions and suffering in the form of black smoke filling your body. And then with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing your mental afflictions and suffering at your heart, dissolving it into your inner wisdom. And then imagine the black cloud is now completely extinguished. And now you're completely free of all mental afflictions and suffering. And just as you wish to be free of suffering, so does everyone else. So now bring to mind someone close to you, a loved one, who's currently experiencing some sort of physical or mental problem or suffering. And picture them very clearly in front of you. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they were free of that problem, free of that suffering. May you be free of all suffering and its causes. And then imagine their problem or suffering in the form of black smoke filling their body. And then with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke out of their body and bringing it into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart. Now imagine that that black cloud is completely extinguished. And now they're completely free of that problem or suffering. And take delight in this. And then allow your field of compassion to expand out to the person seated next to you. They are just like yourself in wishing to be happy and to be free of suffering. And so arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they were free of suffering and its causes. May you be free of all mental afflictions and suffering. And imagine their mental afflictions and suffering in the form of black smoke filling their body. And with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke out of their body, bringing it into the sphere of light at your heart, completely extinguishing it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their mental afflictions and suffering at your heart. And then imagine the black cloud is now completely extinguished. And now they're free of all mental afflictions and suffering. And take joy in this. And then allow your field of compassion to expand out further. And allow your mind to move around. And whoever comes to mind, attend to them. Breathing in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart. And allow your mind to continue to move around. And whoever comes to mind, whether it's an individual or even a group of people, attend to them. Breathing in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart. And then release all appearances and simply allow the mind to come to rest. Simply resting in awareness itself. Simply being aware of being aware. What I'd like to do now is have a look at why is it that we find it so difficult to have compassion for people who behave badly, and also why is it often difficult for us to have compassion for ourselves. Now, if we see someone engaging in some harmful behavior, then the correct perspective is simply that there is a person who's doing or engaging in some sort of bad or harmful behavior. So that is the correct perspective, simply seeing that. But often when someone is behaving badly, we don't tend to have this perspective. Often if someone's behaving badly, we have the perspective of there is a bad person, nasty person, horrible person. So when we take this perspective, what we've done is we've fused the person to the behavior. We've made them one thing. And this fusion of two things making them one in psychology is called cognitive fusion. And it's a false perspective because there are actually two things here. There's the person and the behavior. They are distinct. Whereas when we do cognitive fusion, we fuse them together and make them one thing, then this is a false perspective. When we do this, we set ourselves up for a lot of potential problems. Because in any given situation, we've got really two choices. We either accept or reject. Normally, if someone's behaving badly, we reject. But if we do cognitive fusion and we reject, often what we do, because we've fused the person to the behavior, what we do when we reject is we attack the person. Because the thing that we really don't like is the bad behavior. But because we've fused the person to the bad behavior, we end up attacking the person. We get angry at the person and just verbally or even physically attack the person. Now, we may understand that attacking the person is not really the right thing to do. But then if we do cognitive fusion, the only other option is to accept. And then if we do cognitive fusion, what we do, of course, is instead of attacking the person, we end up accepting their bad behavior. Which, of course, also is not very helpful. So both attacking the person and accepting the bad behavior will not lead to some good outcome. And then, of course, if we do that cognitive fusion, then when we talk about forgiveness or compassion, it becomes almost impossible. Because to have compassion for a bad person feels like what we're saying is, oh, what you did is okay, I don't mind. Of course we should mind. But because we've fused the person to the bad behavior, it becomes very difficult to have compassion for the person. In fact, even to the point where we often say they don't deserve forgiveness or compassion because they're a bad person. So, and it's even worse than that, because if we fuse the person to their behavior and we see them as a bad person, then it becomes almost impossible for us to acknowledge any good qualities they have, because bad people don't do good things. And so if they happen to do something virtuous or good, we say, well, they didn't really mean it, because they're a bad person. They don't do good things. So we end up with a completely biased, lopsided view of that person. We won't be able to acknowledge any of their good qualities. So therefore, this is what happens if we do cognitive fusion. That's why often it's so difficult to have compassion for people behaving badly, because to us it feels like it's not right. And it feels like having compassion or forgiveness for them feels like what we're saying is, your bad behavior, it's okay, I don't mind. That's what it feels like. So of course the solution is to avoid cognitive fusion, because it's a false perspective. Because there are two things here. There's not one thing. There is a person and their behavior. So simply to avoid cognitive fusion, to see the situation in the correct perspective and simply acknowledge there is a person doing or engaging in a harmful behavior. And if we do that, which is the correct perspective, then we can both accept the person and reject the behavior. So we can accept the person, meaning have compassion for the person, and at the same time not accept their bad behavior, be very strong about their bad behavior and address their bad behavior. And help that person to overcome that bad behavior. So therefore, if we have the correct perspective, we can have compassion for the person, and that compassion is to help the person to overcome that negative or harmful behavior. And then, of course, if we have the correct perspective, we have a correct, balanced view of the person, because every person sometimes is engaging in harmful behavior, sometimes engaging in virtuous behavior. And then we can have a correct perspective of the person. So the solution is simply to avoid cognitive fusion and to see the correct perspective. Anyone have any questions on this?
I just have an example, but in reality, I find it really tricky. So say you have someone amongst you that you know, like, has been stealing from your friends, and so you have a thief, and then you have to relate to this being, you know, amongst you and your friends, and it's really hard to, I don't know, I found it really challenging not to, like you say, to judge him and like not wanting to have anything to do with him, and yeah.
So
it's just, in reality, it's really really tricky.
Yeah, there's a couple of points here.
Mm-hmm.
One is exactly as you said, judging.
Yeah.
Judging comes from this.
Yeah.
You're judging the person.
Yeah.
What we need to be doing instead of judging the person is evaluating their behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the evaluation of behavior is, together with compassion, we need wisdom. Because without wisdom, it's going to be difficult to evaluate behavior and to see how to address that bad behavior. Mm-hmm. So that's why in Buddhism, in every situation, instead of reacting to the situation in this way with anger and hatred and so forth, mm-hmm. we are to respond to the situation using wisdom and compassion. And that's all we can do. And of course, there's no book you can go to that says, in this situation, do this, because we have to evaluate every situation on its own merits. Yeah. Every situation is unique. All we can do is use whatever wisdom we have, whatever level of compassion we have, to best evaluate as we can the situation, and then respond to the situation on that basis. And of course, sometimes we respond in a wrong way because maybe our wisdom is not very good. And we respond, we go, oh, that wasn't the right response. And then we learn from that so that next time we respond in a better way. We have more wisdom. And we will make mistakes, but that's the best possible outcome rather than reacting. So yes, it's true, there are many difficult situations, and particularly situations where it's difficult to evaluate the behavior, whether it is really harmful or not. But that's all we can do. I mean, we can't do more than that. And of course, we're going to make mistakes. If we want to be in a situation to know for sure that this is the right thing to do, we'll never respond because we won't know 100%. So all we can do is, as much wisdom and compassion as we have, we respond. That's it. That's all we can do. And we learn from our mistakes. Anything else from this?
with the person who's doing a bad thing. In my experience, there's something about that person which I'm not recognizing as being an aspect of myself. So this person is doing a bad action. I'm now criticizing this person, but in fact, I'm being mirrored here. So I'm being confronted with myself.
Yeah.
And sorry, the second part is that this person has done something bad to me. So to turn that around, it's kind of turning it even double around, you know,
yeah.
Having to take away the hurt that this person is, I assume is intended towards me. At the same time, I have to recognize that which I am not able to address myself.
Yes. So yes, there's a couple of points here. One is that part of the evaluation is that we can observe that behavior, and if it's a behavior that sort of really irritates us, but it doesn't seem to irritate anyone else, then often the case is, as you suggested, is that something in their behavior is mirroring something we are not acknowledging about ourselves. And that's what irritates us. It's a mirror for us, showing us that actually we do that a little bit, but we don't want to acknowledge it. So we don't want to see that because it reminds us that we've got something to work on. So yes, in cases where you're looking at the behavior and somehow we're really upset by that, but no one else is, and it doesn't seem to be really unethical, but we just get annoyed by it. Often this is the case. It's something in their behavior that is showing to us something we are trying to not acknowledge. So that's one point. And then the other point was, again, what was
this person is...
Oh, yeah. So again, as part of the wisdom here is at the deepest level, the wisdom is this wisdom of understanding there's no duality at the deepest level. I mean, this wisdom can come at very simple level, but at the deepest level, this wisdom is there is no independent person there attacking an independent me here. Because as long as we don't have that, then of course we're more likely to react because there's this me here. That person seems to be causing me suffering. So if we develop this wisdom at the deepest level in the Vipassana practice of letting go of this self-grasping, then you'll find that you won't end up in the situation. That, in fact, therefore, it will become easier to develop compassion for the person. Because as long as you have this self-grasping, and if they're directing at me, the focus is going to be on me, not them. So it's going to be hard to develop that. So that's wisdom at the deepest level, to let go of the self-grasping, let go of grasping onto that person, understanding everything's interdependent. Then actually the compassion just naturally comes from that.
And I think I have a third point.
Sure.
So if I might have been accused of being the bad person because of my bad behavior, I'm saying, no, I defend myself. And at some point, this defense is not solving anything. It's not changing anyone else's perspective, not mine. And then I suddenly realize, oh, hang on, but I'm doing the same. I'm judging, I'm putting that person into the same behavior. So in fact, this is also the mirror. So I'm seeing something from another person's perspective, creating light upon which that I'm doing myself.
Exactly. And that's why I was going to come now, is that we do this not only with other people, we do it with ourselves. And this is the reason why we have an epidemic of low self-esteem and self-hatred in our society. Is, again, when we do a harmful behavior, the correct perspective is acknowledge, I have done a harmful behavior. But normally, or very often at least, we go, oh, I'm a bad person. And so when we do this, same thing, accept, reject. If we reject, we end up attacking ourselves, beating ourselves up. And if we accept, we just simply deny, oh, I didn't do anything wrong, it wasn't me. And then, of course, compassion for ourselves, I don't deserve it because I'm a bad person. So we can't have compassion for ourselves because we've seen ourselves as a bad person. I don't deserve compassion, I'm a bad person. There's no such thing as a bad person. There's only people who sometimes engage in harmful bad behavior. No such thing as a bad person. And then, of course, on top of that, then, of course, we identify ourselves with that action. And so we can't even acknowledge any good qualities we have because I'm just a bad person. And of course, we're going to end up with low self-esteem and self-hatred. And related to that is the whole guilt versus regret story. If we've done something harmful and we feel guilty, what are we focusing on? Bad me. So guilt comes from cognitive fusion, from a false perspective. And all that guilt does is it paralyzes us and makes us feel bad. It doesn't even address the negative behavior. So guilt is completely useless. Unfortunately, it seems over the centuries, guilt's been introduced to have power over people because of that. But we don't need to feel guilty about anything. In fact, it's completely useless. All we need to do is have the correct perspective and simply acknowledge, I have done a bad behavior. Then, instead of guilt, we have regret. If we regret, what are we regretting? Bad behavior. So regret comes from correct perspective, guilt comes from false perspective, wrong perspective. So by simply having the correct perspective, we can acknowledge, I have done a bad behavior. We can have compassion for ourselves and address and regret that bad behavior and address our bad behavior. So it becomes a lot easier. So similarly with ourselves and others, if we have the correct perspective. Unfortunately, in our society, we've grown up with this perspective. The way we speak, the way we think, and what's been programmed in us since we were this high. You know, how often do we see when a very young child is misbehaving, the parent or adult goes, bad girl, bad boy. I mean, it's a disaster. It's a disaster. So we grow up in this way.
It's a circle of violence. You know? This is how they think of me, I think of them, I think of myself, they think of themselves.
Yes, I'm the good person, they're the bad person. No such thing. Because also doing this cognitive fusion on the positive side is not helpful. For example, if we've done a good action and someone says, oh, you're a good person, a wonderful person, big head. Oh, yes, I am, aren't I? I'm better than everyone else. I'm a great person. They're not. And then we have a completely lopsided view of ourselves and we just get full of ourselves. Same is when we see someone engaging in a good behavior, don't do this and praise the person. You're a great person, you're a fantastic person, because it's just going to give them a big head. What we need to do is, and we have to do this, is praise their behavior. You know, that action you've done was wonderful, fantastic. So praise actions, not people. Praise our own actions, not ourselves. Because otherwise we end up in this, I'm a good person, they're a bad person. I'm a bad person, they're a good person. There's no such thing as a good person or bad person.
And supporting the idea of self-cherishing.
As well, of course, of course. Because here, we're identifying ourselves with our actions. And we don't just identify ourselves and others with action, we identify ourselves and others with our thoughts, our emotions, our memories, our personalities. But are we our actions or do we have actions? Are we our thoughts or do we have thoughts? Are we our emotions or do we have emotions? Again, there's no such thing as an angry person. You know, people go, I'm an angry person, you better accept that. No such thing as an angry person. There's only people who have a habit of being angry. If you identify with anger, you're stuck. If you acknowledge you have a habit of getting angry, it's an object. You can work with that. You can still feel good about yourself and work with the anger. But if you stuck it to you, you're just going to feel bad. That's me. I'm hopeless. So therefore, if we just avoid the cognitive fusion, things work a lot better. And of course, cognitive fusion is a false perspective anyway.
So what you just said about, so do we have thoughts or are we the thoughts? Do we have behaviors? That's really sort of the definition of what is a person. And because if it's a person that does only do bad things, or I mean mostly, of course, maybe not everything, but overwhelmingly bad actions, then how can we still see this person as what should we think this person is to be separate from its action?
No, here, this is a good point. I was glad you brought it up. We're not separating here. The two extremes is identification and separation. Separation is, I didn't do that. They didn't do that. I'm not responsible because I'm not my actions. I'm not responsible. That's separation. That's pathological. Here, what we're doing is we're distinguishing the person from their behavior, not separating them. There's a link. There is responsibility. So we're not separating, we're just not fusing. So this is the middle way, the correct perspective. So if someone is engaging in a lot of harmful behavior, that doesn't make them a bad person. It just means that person has a very strong habit of engaging in harmful behavior. That's all.
Yeah.
Because as soon as we see this, we're going to attack them. And if we do this, we're going to just feel bad. Oh, I'm just a bad person. I don't deserve compassion or forgiveness. And that's what we see in the world today. All those bad people, oh, we've got to kill them. They're bad people. They're no hope. Let's just kill them, wipe them out. And that's what we see. It's a disaster. Whereas if we say there's people who are very often engaging in very harmful behavior, let's see what we can do to reduce that. Then there's a chance. But if we do this, we just wipe out. Not helpful at all. The question, of course, comes up, and then we'll take a break, is if we are not our thoughts, if we are not our emotions, if we are not our habits, if we are not our behavior, if we're not our personality, because either we are our personality or we have a personality, and if we are not our bodies and we are not our minds, because these are things which we have a body and mind. You can't have something and be it. Impossible. So we have thoughts, we have emotions, we have memories, we have habits, we have personalities, we have a body, we have a mind. None of those are us. That's why we suffer, because we identify ourselves with one or more of those things, which we're not. So we have cognitive fusion. That's why we have suffering. So Vipassana is really about understanding this. And if we can avoid cognitive fusion at the deepest level, not identifying ourselves with our body or mind, then we have the correct perspective. Then we have wisdom and overcome ignorance. Who we really are then, that's the topic for next weekend's retreat.
Oh.
Watch this space.
Watch this space. Any last questions about this before we go for a break? Yeah.
Maybe just about, you say, compassion and loving kindness are
Sure.
relations,
Correct.
but not emotions. Only.
Correct.
They're never connected with.
Yes, they're absolutely connected.
Okay.
But here, from a Buddhist perspective, in fact, in Buddhism, in Buddhist psychology, there's not really any word for emotion. We don't really talk about emotions. We talk about positive states of mind and afflictive states of mind. And then we talk about positive aspirations and harmful aspirations, because that's the key. Of course, if we have this aspiration of compassion and loving kindness, in a given situation, that will probably translate into some sort of emotion, feeling, behavior. But it's what's underneath our emotion and behavior that's the important thing. Because often we see people, you know, having all this nice behavior, but underneath their intention is not so good. They're just putting on a little bit of a show. So what's important is what's underneath. What's the driving intention, not how we sort of smile and seemingly say nice things, because we can do that with not a very good intention. Yeah. So that's what in Buddhism is the key. Of course, this in a given situation will probably result in some sort of emotion and feeling and behavior. But the key is the intention, the motivation, the aspiration behind our emotions and behavior.
I question a little bit because I see this as how can I make the situation so that the person can change their bad behavior? So I say, okay, if I'm compassionate in this so and so, I create an atmosphere where they can actually change. Because if I reject them, then they're they will probably feel stuck and then keep on doing what they're doing and so and so.
Sure.
So I like to address that it's the action and not the person that
Correct.
I'm now attacking.
Right.
And then I can say this is from my perspective and
Sure.
sort of leave it there. And then I start questioning myself, who am I to say that? Or shouldn't they find out themselves? Or, things like that.
Yeah. So, of course, a couple of points there. Of course, we can't make anyone change. If we think that, we're lacking wisdom and compassion. Yeah. So all we can do is be a positive influence as best we can. So to have the idea, I'm going to make that person better.
No, it's just the atmosphere.
Yeah, so that's right. So all we can do is the best we can. I mean, they may not listen to us and continue their bad habits. Okay, we tried. And then maybe next time we try something different. So we shouldn't go into it thinking, I'm going to fix this person. I'm going to make them, because it's not, we can't do that. And then, of course, is that, yes, maybe now we don't know how to really address their bad behavior because our wisdom is very poor, not very well defined, but that shouldn't stop us from trying to help. And part of wisdom is to understand that, we maybe don't have for sure the right answer, and to be open to other views, of course. That's part of wisdom. But all we can do is whatever wisdom and compassion we have, we can offer that in terms of trying to help. Whether that person accepts it or not, we don't know. And whether or not what the advice we're giving is the right one, we don't know. But that's all we can do. I mean, and we should try to do that and not force anything onto anyone, of course, because that's not really, then it's all about me. I know what's best. You need to do that. Then it's not focusing on the person. It's all about me. And that's unfortunately what we see sometimes, is when people try to be, well, they're not trying to be compassionate, because in the guise of compassion, all they want to do is change people so they're not sort of interfering with them. I don't like the way that person's behaving, because it's not because that person's suffering or making a mess, but it's all about me. That person's behavior, I don't like that. It's affecting me in a not a nice way. I want to change that. That's not wisdom or compassion. That's self-cherishing. So we need to, of course, let go of that. Otherwise, we just do what we normally do. We manipulate, oh, I don't like that. You better do that change.
But I actually call that manipulation.
What's that?
Saying, showing that this is a way to, or creating this atmosphere and so on. So, I'm a social worker and a teacher as well, and I do that all the time. It's kind of my profession, right?
But
so setting up this atmosphere where you can learn.
Right.
And then somehow I set a goal. I don't expect you to reach the goal, but I expect you to, at some level, kind of understand some of it, or at least that that this has been an option to you. Yeah.
So I think with the manipulation is, of course, we can use the word manipulation in that sense, but generally I think when we talk about manipulation, it's self-focused. We are manipulating that for our own interest.
Then facilitation.
Yeah. So I think, but that's
fine.
It's fine, and that's what we need to do. And I think we would appreciate it if someone is providing us with an environment for us to improve.
But then I go in that as well, saying, well, that's my way. I would like to live.
Yeah.
Because I seek teaching.
So again, I think the key in all of this is, where is our focus? Is it really looking to benefit that person, or is it more about me? I want to see this. I want that. They need to do what I think is best. Then it's not so good. So we need to make sure that the focus is really on their benefit and not on sort of ourselves. That's that's, I think, the key in all of this is where is the real focus?
Mm.
You know?
Mm.
Quick question. Just with the focus, if it's on me or the other person, is the wisdom sometimes to remove yourself from the situation? For example, in a violent relationship, where
To come out of it. Yeah, of course.
the wisdom is I can't address this behavior. The focus has to be on me. I have to remove myself from this situation because you can't.
Yeah, like for example, a simple example is the person is yelling at us. Wisdom might say, don't say anything to them because whatever I say is just going to make them more angry. But in that occasion where someone's enraged, wisdom might say, okay, the best thing to do is just back off, get out of there and come back when they've settled down a bit and then try and talk to them. Yes, of course. And if it's an abusive relationship, wisdom and compassion says, well, this is just destructive, so we need to cut. But yeah, so yes, that's right. So we're not running away, but it's a strategy.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, running away and not dealing with it, of course, is not a very good strategy. But this is not running away. This is actually part of the strategy.
Yeah. So conscious decision.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was just with respect to what you said, because I also been thinking a lot about this. If it's, if it is just manipulation with people or whatever, but I also think that if you just say, oh, I can't make a choice on anything, it's just everything is equally good, then you very easily end up in that there's nothing that's right and nothing that's wrong. And I think it's okay that you actually think that there are some ideals or there are some ethical things that are actually right, and you don't have to really compromise with them. Maybe you cannot force people into them, but you can still say, I think this is more right than this, even so you don't have to like accept or respect or viewpoints. And I think you very easily fall into
That's
that.
right. I mean, there's this sort of sort of strange ideas floating around these days of like, you know, this idea of non-judgmental, be non-judgmental. People are interpreting that as meaning don't evaluate anything. Everything's okay. I mean, that's a disaster. It's a disaster. So non-judgmental is don't attack, don't react. We have to evaluate whether something's beneficial or harmful. And, you know, and then this idea of everyone's equal, you know, yes, we're all equal in wanting to be happy and wanting to be free of suffering. But, you know, then this idea of equality goes to some crazy extreme as well. We often see that, and that's a disaster. You know, that's an absolute disaster, because that's not really the meaning of equality. No. So of course there is hierarchy in terms of good and bad behavior and so forth, you know. So to sort of put it all in one thing is actually not a correct perspective. So these things like being non-judgmental and equality and stuff, we need to understand them in a proper way and not in some strange way. Otherwise we end up with all sorts of problems. Okay, let's take a break, 15-minute break, and we'll come back in the last session. We'll start with a short meditation, and then we'll have a look at how to integrate a lot of these things into our daily life. Okay, first a tea break.
Thank you.
Let's start this last session with meditation. So finding a nice, comfortable posture. And if you wish, of course, you can always use the Shavasana or corpse posture. As an act of loving kindness for yourself, allow your awareness to descend into the body. Simply becoming aware of sensations throughout the body. And using the out breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. Allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And letting go of any thoughts of the past or the future. And simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. Simply focusing on the sensations of the breath throughout the body. We all want to be happy, and we all want to be free of problems and suffering. And it often seems to us as if the source of our happiness and the source of our suffering is out there in the world. And as a result, one of the main methods we use to try to overcome suffering and find happiness is that we try to manipulate things around us. We try to attract people, places, and things that seem to be the source of our happiness. And we try to push away or avoid people, places, and things that seem to be the source of our suffering. The question, however, is this an effective strategy? Are we getting any closer to overcoming our suffering and finding genuine happiness? No matter how hard we try to control or manipulate things, we still seem to encounter suffering. And we're still chasing after that elusive happiness. All we're really doing with this approach is that we are trapping ourselves in the hope-fear cycle. Hoping for pleasant experiences and fearing or worrying about unpleasant experiences. And if we don't get the things we want, we often become very frustrated. And even if we do get the things we want, they never seem to fully satisfy us. And we simply end up craving for more. And we often end up with a lot of disappointment and dissatisfaction when things don't live up to our expectations. So what's the solution? From a Buddhist perspective, we're simply looking in the wrong place. What would happen if we turned our attention to our own mind? What would happen if we began to cultivate more mindfulness? Cultivated a more calm, clear, and focused mind? And what would happen if we reduced our mental afflictions, such as craving, jealousy, anger, anxiety? And what would happen if we could begin to see things more clearly and accurately, without projecting or distorting what we apprehend? And we began to cultivate loving kindness and compassion for ourselves and others. And instead of reacting to things out of old habits, we could begin to respond in ways more conducive to our own and others' happiness. What would happen if we could see difficult situations in our life as opportunities for growth, rather than seeing them as problems or obstacles? So let's set a positive motivation. A motivation wishing to discover practical methods to overcome our own suffering and to find genuine happiness. And we can expand that motivation out to include others, also wishing to help those around us overcome their suffering and find genuine happiness. And then release all appearances and simply allow the mind to come to rest. Simply resting in luminously clear awareness. Simply being aware of being aware. Relaxed and focused. Open and spacious. And then in conclusion, we can dedicate the positive potential that we've gathered, not just from this meditation, but from the whole weekend together, towards that goal of genuine happiness and overcoming suffering. and not just for ourselves, but for all living beings. And then it's often traditional as part of the dedication to recite a dedication prayer. So while I read out the verses of a dedication prayer from great Indian Master Shantideva, you might like to reflect on the words of this prayer. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled by a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then, may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. So again, if you're in the corpse posture, to finish by rolling over onto your right side, and then slowly sitting up with the assistance of both arms. What I'd like to do for our remaining time in this session is have a look at integration, how to integrate these practices, particularly this shamatha practice, into daily life. And also as part of that, going back to a little bit what we did yesterday afternoon, how to then structure our life to be able to get maximum benefit from these practices. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about how to bring these sorts of practices into daily life in terms of how to structure the day. So as we saw, any practice, for it to be effective, really requires two components: a meditation component where we're internalizing, and then what we do for the rest of the day in terms of integrating that into daily life. And with respect to meditation practice, again, the key is continuity. Continuity means to have a daily meditation practice. And with a daily meditation practice, then often it's very much recommended to do the daily meditation practice first thing in the morning, because that's where most likely we're most fresh, we can dedicate certain time to it, and also, of course, it's a good way to start the day, and usually tends to be more quiet at that time of the day. So it's very helpful to pick a particular time to meditate, because one of the most difficult things with meditation practice is to develop the habit. And if we keep changing the time, we're not really developing a habit. And also, it's very helpful where we meditate is to make it an inviting place, somewhere we would like to go to meditate. So, of course, if we have the luxury of having a spare room where we live, then that would be ideal. Then we can even close the door and use that for meditation. But probably most of us don't have that luxury. But at least then we could set aside a corner of the room for meditation and associate that with just meditation, and make it inviting, make it comfortable, clean, and inviting. And in terms of the meditation location, of course, there are a few things we can do to help with our meditation practice. Not only, again, making sure it's comfortable and inviting and clean, but also the place where we meditate. If it's too hot and stuffy, of course, we're just going to fall into drowsiness. So not too hot and stuffy. Maybe also not too dark, might be also get sleepy. But likewise, if it's too cold or light, then maybe also we get some agitation. So we can adjust the light and the temperature. Also, of course, it'd be nice if that place was a quiet place, not too noisy. And also with the meditation, we need to ensure that we're getting enough sleep. Unfortunately, in our busy modern lifestyles, we never really seem to have enough time for everything. And what we cut often is sleep. We cut down the sleep. And somehow we manage to function. But when it comes to meditation, if we're not getting enough sleep, it really isn't going to work. So make sure that we get enough quality sleep. And also what you'll find, of course, is that if you engage in a regular meditation practice, and particularly if you're integrating it into daily life, you may find that that combination, because you're not really getting so much stress and tiredness, you may actually find that you would need maybe less sleep then anyway. Also, of course, very important with the meditation is to have the good posture. So really work on that posture. And together with that posture, of course, to do some body work, to do some sort of yoga, tai chi, qigong, some sort of physical exercise to make the body more serviceable and flexible. And of course, as part of that, very helpful to have a healthy diet. Unfortunately, in our modern society, also, it seems like there's this epidemic of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. And of course, there are many factors which contribute to that. But again, unfortunately, in our modern society, one of the more common factors that seem to contribute is diet, particularly way too much sugar in the diet. So if we can try to have a healthy diet, that's also going to be very helpful. And as we've already said, with the meditation sessions, quality over quantity. So again, it's much better to meditate for a short time with focus rather than trying to meditate too long and simply end up in dullness and distraction. So as I think I already mentioned, very helpful to set a timer. Because if we don't set a timer, then of course, on days where things are not going very well, there's a good likelihood that after maybe 5 or 10 minutes, we're just going to give up because things are not going well. And then, of course, if we do that, that's not very helpful, because then we're still the slaves of our mind. The mind is dictating to us. And one of the qualities we certainly need to cultivate in the spiritual path is perseverance in the face of difficulty. So if we have a timer, even if things are going difficult, we'll persevere. And so that's going to help us to be more persevering in the face of difficulty. Also, of course, if things are going well in the meditation and we don't have a timer, then generally what we do is we just simply keep meditating because we're enjoying it, and we keep meditating until we don't enjoy it anymore and things are not going so well, and when we stop. And the thing we remember most about meditation, of course, is how it ended. So if we're always ending in dullness, distraction, frustration, that's what we're going to start to associate with meditation. We're not going to really want to meditate the following day. But if we have a timer, things are going well, we stop, then that's what we remember. We'll be enthusiastic to want to meditate again the following day. So again, quality over quantity. If you want to meditate longer each morning and you can sustain that, you can sustain, or you can want to meditate, say, for an hour, but you can't sustain a whole hour in one session, break it into 2 or 3 sections with a little 2-minute break in the middle, maybe get up and stretch a bit, and that's going to be very helpful. With these practices, of course, as a beginner, then sometimes it can be helpful to actually listen to a guided meditation a number of times until we get to understand the various points in the meditation, particularly the more analytical meditations, the loving kindness, compassion, Vipassana style meditation. Sometimes they have a lot more instructions, but even the Shamatha instructions can be useful for a short time to just listen to that. And then, of course, when we get used to the technique, then we can sort of let go of that. Otherwise, we tend to get a little bit lazy and not self-sufficient. Also, of course, what to meditate on in the morning. Of course, in this retreat, we've primarily focused on the Shamatha practice. But again, as I mentioned, I think it's important not to just do Shamatha practice in the morning. It can get a little bit unbalanced. So I think for us as beginners, particularly if we don't have very good attention skills, if we really are falling into dullness and distraction a lot, then it's good to emphasize the Shamatha practice. And again, with the object of Shamatha, use the object that works best for you. Of course, in this retreat, we focused on 3 objects: the breath, mind, and resting in awareness. That doesn't mean you have to use one of those 3. If you have another object that you prefer, by all means use that. And use that in the Shamatha practice. If you keep changing the object all the time, we're not really going to go in much deeper. So of course, as a beginner, we can experiment, try each one a little bit for a week or so, or 10 days. And then after that time, we can see which one really seems to work best for us, and then stay with that one and don't keep changing all the time. But of course, then to balance that Shamatha practice with some of the compassion wing of practice that we've looked at a little bit, and then also we can balance that a little with a bit of a Vipassana practice, which of course is going to be the topic for next weekend's retreat. So that's the meditation a little bit in the morning. And then of course we need to bring what we meditate on into the day. So of course here we're mainly emphasizing or talking about the Shamatha practice. So what we need to bring into the day, of course, is mindfulness. We really need to continue to cultivate mindfulness throughout the day. So of course, at the beginning of the day, we can set that intention to be mindful throughout the day. But to help implement that, it's useful to use what's called triggers, to have triggers to remind us throughout the day to be more mindful. And those triggers can take a number of forms. One, of course, is to pick certain activities that we do regularly each day and make a conscious effort that every time we do that activity to really be present with it. Examples, of course, are things like brushing the teeth, eating meals, and so forth. We do those regularly each day. And if we can really make a conscious effort to be aware of the toothbrush on the gums and so forth while we're brushing the teeth, instead of quickly brushing the teeth and thinking about all sorts of things. And then also eating meals is a classic. You know, normally now we're eating meals quickly because we're running out of time, we're rushing off somewhere, we're not really enjoying the food anyway. If we can really be present with the meal, we'll also be a mindful exercise, we'll also probably enjoy our meals much more than we do now. But also we can use modern technology to help us with the triggers. So there are many apps now we can put on our smartphones, iPhones, where we can program them to send some bell or alarm at regular intervals through the day, and when that goes off, then simply stop whatever you're doing and for a very short time do a little mindfulness exercise. And that can be simply focusing on the breath for 3 breaths. And you'll be surprised at how a little short mindfulness exercise interdispersed throughout the day can really get us in the habit of being more mindful in general. And then, of course, also through the day, one of the things that we saw, particularly this afternoon with the compassion wing of the practice, is this idea of cognitive fusion. So also I think it's very helpful in our daily life in terms of the way we're thinking and speaking and seeing things, is to really avoid that cognitive fusion with respect to ourselves and others. And that's going to be very helpful in the way we're thinking, speaking, and behaving. Also, of course, as I briefly mentioned in the meditation we just did, is that often when we're faced with difficulties in our life, we tend to see those difficulties as some sort of problem or obstacle. And then we have some aversion to it. And then it really makes it really much bigger than it really is. So if we can see those difficult situations in our life not as somehow problems or obstacles, but as opportunities, then instead of having aversion to them, we'll be able to see them as ways of, as fuel for improving as a person and in our spiritual practice. And then, of course, at the end of the day, it's also good to finish the day on a good note. And there's a couple of things we can do there. Of course, if we have time and energy, then another meditation at the end of every day is a great idea. If we don't have the time and energy to do that at the end of the day, then there's at least 2 things we can do. One helpful thing to do at the end of every day is to do a review of our day. How did our day go? And then we can focus on 2 aspects. First, we can focus on any negative behavior that we've done through the day, maybe even thoughts, speech, or physical actions. And probably with this, to make it sort of feasible, not to go through every little single negative thing we've done, but rather maybe pick sort of the 3 main negative things we did during that day. And then with each of those 3 things, we can do 4 things that can help us to purify that negative habit and tendency. And in Buddhism, this is often called the 4 opponent powers. The first of those is regret. So remember from this afternoon that if we have done some negative, harmful action and we do the cognitive fusion with regard to that, often we just feel guilty about having done that negative behavior. So again, to avoid that cognitive fusion, not to identify ourselves with that behavior and simply acknowledge, I have done that harmful behavior today. And then instead of feeling guilty, we can have sincere regret for having done that negative behavior. And already that sincere regret is weakening that negative habit. The second thing we can do is what's called reliance. And this is about, or sometimes it's translated as foundation. And that is about picking ourselves back up and reaffirming the positive direction of our life, the positive direction that we want to follow our life. Because if we've done some harmful, negative behavior, we've sort of fallen down from our foundation, our direction we want to follow our life. So if we've done something harmful, then to reaffirm our positive direction in life. And of course, any of you who've done a little bit of study in Tibetan Buddhism, which is part of the Mahayana tradition, then you'll understand that in the Mahayana tradition, this takes on a very specific form in terms of reaffirming our refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and then cultivating this aspiration of bodhicitta for enlightenment. But even if we're not Buddhist, we can simply reaffirm the positive direction that we want to follow our life. And the third point we can do is think about some sort of positive remedy for that negative behavior. For example, if during that day we remembered that we verbally abused someone, said something very nasty to someone, then a remedy can be simply, okay, tomorrow morning I'm going to go and apologize to them. Some sort of practical remedy. And the fourth point is make a strong resolve not to engage in that harmful behavior again. Here, of course, we need to be very practical. If the negative behavior is something that we tend to do very regularly, for example, maybe we're the sort of person that often tells lies, then of course there's no point here saying I'm never going to lie again because we've just told another lie. Rather, if it's a strong negative habit that we engage in, then set a time limit here and say, okay, tomorrow I'm not going to do that thing. If that's way too difficult, you can say for the next hour I'm not going to do that thing. Pick an amount of time that with some effort, normally you can manage. And through that, you can even break very strong habits. So if at the end of the day, we review our day, we can very quickly go through those 4 points with maybe the top 3 negative things we did during the day. And that will really work on resolving those negativities and reducing that negative habit. Equally important, I think, when we review the day, is to also focus on our good behavior. Because again, unfortunately, in our modern society, we always really seem to focus on the negative with respect to ourselves and others. And not only that, but with cognitive fusion. So it's very important to have that balanced view of ourselves and others. So at the end of the day, equally important, review the day in terms of the positive things we've thought, said, and done during the day. Again, pick the top 3 maybe, and then for each one, we can rejoice in having done that positive thing. So again, not to develop pride and do cognitive fusion, I was a very good person today. Rather, that was a very good behavior, and rejoice in that good behavior. And then make a strong determination to continue to engage in that positive behavior the following day. In that way, we can strengthen the positive habits. So through doing these 2 things, we can reduce negative habits and increase the positive habits. So this is a good way of rounding out the day. And then the other thing we can all do is when we go to bed, we can lie down in the corpse posture, the Shavasana posture, and then engage in a little Shamatha practice, particularly focusing on the sensations of the breath throughout the body, emphasizing relaxation, particularly if we've had a very stressful, hectic day and we have a lot of tension in the body and mind, is simply do that, releasing all sorts of tension, any sort of tension we have. So that's a shamatha practice, a mindfulness practice, also a way of releasing tension in the body and the mind. And we do that as long as we can maintain some alertness, and that may only be 2 or 3 minutes, maybe 5, 10, 15 minutes. When we start to get a little bit drowsy, then simply mentally note, okay, my practice has come to an end. Move out of that posture into whatever sleeping posture you have. And so then it can be a good transition into sleep as well. So that's something we certainly can do at the end of each day. So this is a little bit on how to set up the day. And now what I'd like to do is, relating a little bit to what we talked about yesterday afternoon, is that if we want the shamatha practice, particularly this idea of mindfulness, to really be effective in transforming our life, then we really need to have a framework for that practice. And one way of talking about framework in Buddhism is we can talk about 3 elements. We can talk about a framework or integrating view, meditation, conduct. View here, of course, is in terms of our worldview. Because if we don't fix up our worldview, if we still have a worldview that happiness and suffering is coming from out there, and happiness means I have to have more pleasure, if that's our worldview, then mindfulness is not really going to get us very far. And we're never really going to achieve any sort of well-being or happiness in any sustainable way. So part of worldview here is to really understand this idea of temporal pleasure versus genuine happiness. To really understand this idea of genuine happiness, inner well-being, that is a state of happiness that is not a stimulus-based happiness, and it does not require any particular stimulus to be out there. So if we can really reflect on this, then we're going to start to have a worldview that's going to be more conducive for us to really find some sort of happiness in our life. And then as part of that worldview, we're going to understand that getting more stuff, more material wealth, is not really going to make us more happy. In fact, there was a study done where I saw recently where they mapped material wealth versus happiness. And of course, in the initial stages, it did actually improve, meaning if you had 0 wealth, you didn't even have a roof over your head and food in the stomach. So then a lot of suffering. So yes, initially it sort of went like this. But then what they found was when you get to a level of wealth that was enough to have a roof over your head and food in the stomach, more wealth, happiness didn't go up, it actually went down.
Wow.
It actually went down. So therefore that's sort of showing that money is not going to buy happiness. Of course, a minimum amount of money is necessary for, clothes on your back and roof over your head and so forth. But so if we can shift our worldview in terms of genuine happiness versus pleasure, then also we're going to find we're going to have time to devote to our practice rather than spending all of our time trying to gather more material wealth, make more money, get more pleasure and so forth. So we're going to be able to shift our priorities in life. And we don't want to be one of these people then who then later in our life look back on our life and are full of regrets. So we can avoid that by really reflecting on this and really shifting our worldview in a very healthy way. In fact, there was a Australian lady, a hospice worker in the hospice movement for many years, and she talked to a lot of her patients over the many years about their biggest regrets in life, and she compiled this list, very well known on the internet, the top 5 regrets of the dying. And the number 1 regret that she found in pretty well just about everyone was their biggest regret was working too hard and not spending enough time with family and friends in more meaningful ways. So that was the number 1 regret. So I think we can avoid that if we work on our worldview and really start to work on this idea of inner well-being versus chasing after pleasure. And then, of course, at a deeper level in terms of worldview within Buddhism, and that's something we're going to look at next weekend in the Vipassana retreat, at the deeper level of worldview is this worldview of the nature of reality, in terms of how we exist in the world around us exists. And at the deepest level then, to really appreciate this idea of interdependency. There is no independent me, independent world. So if we can incorporate that into our worldview, then of course our meditation and conduct will really have a very good framework, and we're going to really have a lot of benefit. So then, of course, on the basis of improving our worldview, then we have a framework for our meditation practice. And in the meditation practice, of course, here we mainly talked about the shamatha, developing a calm, clear, focused mind. But of course, on that basis, then we can engage in the two other main core areas of meditation practice, the wisdom or vipassana practice and the compassion wing of practice. And then we can really start to cultivate wisdom and compassion in meditation as well. And then, of course, we need to support and integrate that with conduct, our daily life conduct. And of course, at the foundation level of conduct is to adopt an ethical lifestyle. And again here, particularly if we have improved our worldview, particularly in terms of understanding the interdependent nature of everything, then that is going to be really the basis of our ethical lifestyle. Through the understanding of interdependency, that will really feed into having a more ethical lifestyle. And of course, the more ethical lifestyle we have, this is going to feed back into our meditation practice. So if we can sort of focus on those three areas, improving physical view, our meditation practice and daily life conduct, integrate those three elements, then we're going to get the most out of any practice, and in particular here, the shamatha practice that we've been focusing on this weekend. Any questions about anything I've covered so far?
So if you have other daily practices that you do, would you, due to time restraint, shorten them both or have shifting days on them?
Good question. Of course, if our worldview is dominated by wanting to make more money and so forth, we're never going to be able to have the time required for these practices. So that's why if we can fix up our worldview, then at least we will have enough time to be able to devote to these practices. But again, we won't have unlimited time. So therefore, there's no hard and fast rule, but I think it depends on us as a little bit as an individual. And also probably that will shift a little bit depending on what's going on in our life. For example, if we're the sort of person that is really have very poor attention skills, then I don't know if there's a lot of value in just doing the vipassana, wisdom, the compassion practices, because they're not going to be very effective, because we're going to be dull and distracted, and we can put a lot of time into them and not really move forward. And unfortunately, that's a little bit what we see in just about all all Buddhist traditions in the world today. I mean, all Buddhist traditions talk about the importance of the concentration practice, the shamatha practice. But if you look at the various traditions and what they're actually meditating on, rarely do you see it sort of mentioned even. Like, you know, often in the Theravada traditions, you just hear about vipassana, 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 vipassana. In the Tibetan tradition, you often hear about deity yoga, bodhicitta, emptiness. And of course, all of these are wonderful practices, but if we're trying to do all these practices with a dull and distracted mind, we can put a lot of effort into them and not get very far. So therefore, I think as a beginner, particularly if we have very poor attention skills, I think it's going to be very helpful to emphasize the shamatha practice, but again, not exclusive. So then regarding your question, what we can do, of course, is some days we could maybe just do a shamatha practice, and on other days we can start with 5 or 10 minutes and then do 15 or 20 minutes of compassion, loving kindness, vipassana. And we can do those other practices a little bit depending on where we're at. If we're feeling that we're sort of lacking a little bit of compassion, then maybe we can emphasize that for a week or two. Or if we're feeling that the wisdom needs a bit of work, emphasize that. So we can be a little bit flexible on that depending on where we're at. So, but I think, you know, we can mix it up a little bit. Some days maybe just shamatha, other days begin with a little bit of shamatha and then mainly on compassion, loving kindness, or vipassana or whatever. So I think we can be a little bit flexible on that. And of course, if we have a qualified teacher, they can really help tailor that mix in a more effective way. Of course, we as an individual can look and go, well, I think maybe it's good to do this and that and this mix, but at our level, it's hard for us to know what's going to be the most effective for us. Whereas a qualified teacher, they've gone through all of that and they know, they can just look at you really and tell where you're at. And then they can really help you make that mix as well. So having a qualified teacher can also help in this regard.
So as a beginner, would you recommend to do the shamatha and as a beginning and not do vipassana, like wait a little bit with the vipassana, or would you?
What do you mean by wait? Wait for?
I don't know, like wait till you are like stronger in the shamatha practice.
Well, of course, I mean, shamatha's, if you do it, you improve. But I mean, I think just doing shamatha longer term is probably not going to be a very balanced approach. So again, it really depends on us as an individual. So I wouldn't probably recommend just doing shamatha for months and months and months. But maybe to emphasize that, and then of course add in vipassana, compassion, loving kindness as we feel fit or necessary or useful or helpful. So I sort of mix it up a little bit and not sort of go to the extremes on that.
I have one more question.
Sure.
So if I feel like that I'm already really attached and I have like a really hard time letting go of people especially, and how can I work with that the best way?
Attachment. With all of mental afflictions, there are a number of approaches we can use to working with them. And I think it's helpful to not just have one approach, but to use different perspectives on working with that. So, for example, with attachment, there are a number of approaches we can use. One, of course, is simply the shamatha approach, meaning that if we develop a calm, clear, focused mind, you'll find it's actually sort of harder for attachment to come up because we're more content with the state of mind. So shamatha itself can reduce that attachment because we feel more content and peaceful. So that's one thing we can do. Another thing we can do, of course, and this is often mentioned as the sort of the direct antidote to attachment, is to reflect on impermanence, the transient nature of everything. Because if we can see things as in a constant state of flow, then there's nothing to grab. Because attachment can only operate if there's something that we can hold on to. So if we can bring our intellectual understanding of impermanence, which we already have, if we can meditate on that and internalize that and experientially see things as constantly changing and flowing, then there's nothing much for attachment to grab. So that's going to help reduce attachment. Of course, also, the other thing is to work on loving kindness so that, particularly in a relationship, we can focus on the person and instead of me, and having attachment. So that's going to help in terms of relationships. And then, of course, at the more deeper level, we can use vipassana, you know, because it's I am attached to that. So we can use the Vipassana in terms of the idea of emptiness to search for the me and to search for the object of attachment. And through that way, the attachment will drop. So we've got all these approaches, and I think it's helpful to use a number of different approaches, and then we can sort of come at it from different angles. That can be very helpful.
Thank you very much.
Okay, then just a couple more points and then we'll wrap up today. So again, as I mentioned, continuity is the key to success. So continuity here, we're talking about having a daily meditation practice, but also continuity can mean to continue to work with what we meditate on in daily life, to integrate it into daily life. And I think here also, as part of this continuity, very important to drop this expectations, because we're always full of expectations, and so we're grasping at achieving some sort of result. And the more expectations we have, the more that's going to derail our practice. So if we can really simply understand what the practice is, how to do it, what the goal is, and then drop all expectations and simply apply the best effort we can, and then whatever happens is okay. If we can have that attitude, then I think we will progress better than if we have this attitude of expectation, of hope and fear and so forth. And to help us in our practice, of course, as I mentioned yesterday, I think a key element as a beginner is this idea of Sangha, spiritual community, to really get support for the practice, to meet together regularly, maybe some meditation, discussion together regularly, get some support, feel like you're not really on your own. And of course, with any particular practice, it's good to then receive more teachings and to read more about it. Here in the Shamatha practice, then in terms of reading about the Shamatha practice, the book I really can recommend is Attention Revolution by Alan Wallace. I really find that a very good book in terms of Shamatha practice. And all in that book, he also talks about the loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy practices as well. And then also, I think what is very helpful in terms of practice is at least once or twice a year, if you can manage, is to do a retreat. And as a beginner, group retreat is the much better option, because in a group retreat, basically you just have to turn up. The structure is there, someone's guiding it, and you get the group energy. Whereas if, as a beginner, you try to do a personal retreat, you have to be self-motivating, you have to make your own structure, and then you have to deal with all your excuses for not doing the practice. Whereas in a group environment, and then you don't have any group energy. So I think it's much better as a beginner to start with some group retreats, much easier. And once you start to get in the habit of that, then you can slowly start to do a little bit of personal retreat. But again, start very short, maybe a couple of days. Don't start with a month personal retreat, for example. I think it's going to be too difficult. So I think if we can manage at least once or twice a year to do a group retreat, that will give you you'll be able to go deeper into the practice and give you a boost in the practice as well. So I think that's going to be very helpful. And then the very last point is then again to receive more teachings on these sorts of practices. And in terms of this weekend, I think we've got this videoed and it's all going up on YouTube. So you can have a look at that. And also, I have my own website. glensvensson.org, and I also put a lot of the audio from various things that I lead, and also I put a lot of materials on that website. So if there's anything on there that you find useful, I've got, for example, a 9-day Shamatha retreat, I think from last year or this year I led in Estonia. All the audio's on there from that. So you can use that also if you start to do a personal retreat and you want to sort of intermediate between completely solitary in a group, you could use audio from a group retreat and use that as the basis of your session. So you're doing your own retreat, but you've got some structure, you've got some guidance. So that's sort of a bit of a middle way approach. So I've got some things there you could use on the website. So that's all I wanted to mention this weekend. Any last questions before we finish this weekend? Okay. Then thank you for coming on the weekend, and I hope you got something out of it, and I hope to see you next weekend in the Vipassana retreat. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we have a short